So we've sort of hit the history in less than 15 minutes, which is impressive, considering who we
Oh, I
have.
wasn't there to
I
talk
know
about
what
that
I
first
was
slide.
just. That's why I was like, how come we're so far? Oh,
Didn't we have 17 minutes on that first slide for
we
Anderson?
did. All right, so let's get started. It's January 22nd. We are talking SharePoint intelligent versioning today. And so, as I said, that's our topic. What we're going to start, we're going to level set and go all the way back. So talking about the intelligent versioning piece of this is going to be the thing we'll talk about last. We're going to start with what's SharePoint versioning all up. What's the benefits of versioning? And there are many. There are a few pitfalls, though, and so Derek will be talking about that. Todd will go into configuring and managing those versions and then tell us what this intelligent versioning thing is all about. I do not see Mr. Anderson, so we will move on without him. So SharePoint versioning, what is it? So we've had it for a very long time. It's for both document libraries and lists, and they've had this capability automatically since at least 2007, and I think I remember it in 2003. So I'm pretty sure it's been around forever.
I think Portal in 2003 had it. I don't remember if Team Services did.
Right, I'm thinking of Portal. So yes, I think we're all in agreement that it's at least 2007, if not earlier. So the versioning settings are at that list and library level, but there are some options, and even we didn't know about all the options. So we'll be telling you some new things, or at least Todd will.
Yeah.
So around the time that Microsoft announced library rollback, versions got automatically set to 500. So by default, when you create a new list or library, the versioning was set to save up to 500 instances of your item. And so that happened. And then the sort of downside of all of this is that storage is consumed for every version. So in lists, that doesn't particularly matter as much, but for libraries, that can be a really big deal, because every time you tweak one little thing, you're getting a whole new version of that document. So you really need to start thinking about version management as part of your information architecture. Obviously, if you're in a tenant, you have a lot of users, but you're not storing a lot of content, then maybe you're not worried about space, and so it's not something that's on your radar. But when you run out of space, then you really start to worry about the fact that you have these things, and oh no, what are you going to do? So planning ahead or thinking about it ahead is not the worst thing in the world, and sort of determining what you want to have some of your default settings to be, and those types of things. All right. So, is Anderson here yet? No. Okay.
Oh,
so
wait, I see him. He's
on
here.
his way. On his way.
I'm here.
Well, then you take over, Mark. I'm happy to let you do it. So I gave you the first intro slide. What was SharePoint versioning? Why don't you tell us then about the document library settings, because they're special.
Yes, they are, aren't they? So this, when you actually want to make some of the changes to versioning based on what Julie was just talking about, you end up going to a list or library settings page and then picking versioning settings. And it looks something like this. You can have major or minor versioning. So you sort of decide what type of versioning you want, and then skipping that version time limit section, because Todd's going to talk about it. There's the version count limit. How many versions do you want to keep of any given object? It could be a list item, could be a library file in a library. The default is that 500, and the default is also only major versions. I wouldn't suggest you change any of that unless you have specific reasons to change that. Those scenarios get more complicated. The settings down at the bottom with draft item security and requiring checkout, people change that stuff from time to time, and it never seems to go well. So unless you have a group of people who are agreeing very clearly on how they want the process to work, we're going to check out documents. That actually locks them for editing from other people. So unless you know that you're going to check things out and check them back in, you'll just end up with a whole bunch of checked out documents that don't that nobody can get to and nobody can see, etc. So don't change those settings unless you actually have very specific needs for them.
We run into this one all the time when doing migrations too, because any checked out document can't be migrated. So if you're using ShareGate,
right.
well, it's not a ShareGate thing, it's a SharePoint thing. But when we're using ShareGate, we have to go and run a report ahead of time to be like, hey, what do you got checked out? So that all that can be mitigated before we do migration. So it's definitely a thing you want to be cautious about. All right.
And this is also a place where you can get that weird thing where some people see one version of a document and other people see a different version of the document because of different permissions.
Which I've used to my advantage in the past. Before we had the SharePoint framework, I'm going a little off script here, but I can do it. Before we had the SharePoint framework, I implemented what I called a CDN Lite, where I created a site collection called a CDN, and then I would check my JavaScript files into that document library with versioning on, and so I could have a draft version that all the people that had draft edit access to the library could see. Ergo, we could have a script editor, a content editor, web part on another site, and they would run the draft version of the JavaScript file or the HTML file, the CSS file, or whatever it was. And all the other users that pointed to the same file would get the checked in one or the production one. So we've actually, you can use that to your advantage, but in this case, it can also.
You were ahead of your time, Julie.
I wasn't, I didn't even know it.
Yeah.
All right, benefits of versioning. Derek.
All right. So, I mean, some of this is a little self-explanatory, but obviously the biggest benefit of of versioning is it provides an audit trail, right? Who changed what and when. We also get the ability to, do document control, the ability to revert back to certain versions of a document. And so those are really the bread and butter of versioning. It does improve collaboration because it increases accountability, it increases tracking. So literally, I know that Julie went in and she redlined that, she made that change in that document that I was working in. From a compliance and a record keeping standpoint, it also lets us roll back and say, and I don't know how this is in other countries, but I know in the US, there are often there are regulations that says, show me this policy at this point in time, because somebody is litigating something and they need to know what that policy looked like. Version history lets us roll back and get that document very, very quickly. And also, one of the things that I didn't know about until we started doing this was there was a new feature called rollback the entire library. So if something gets corrupted in the library, if there's a bad file, or if there's basically tanks the entire library, there's actually an opportunity for us to go in and roll it back to a very specific point. Next slide. And because I didn't know about this, I wanted to make sure that I showed it to folks. So to get there, if you go into the Modern Library and under the library settings, from the gear, you can actually get this, restore this library. You do have to be an owner of the site in order to do this. If you just have edit access, you cannot do that. So restore this library. And then depending on the library and the changes that were made to the library, you'll get a series of date and timestamps. So 1 week ago, 1 day ago, when what, or the ability to set a custom date in the past. And so you can do that, and then you can just roll it back. Now this is disaster recovery, right? Because you're going to lose anything that was changed in the middle. So just be aware of that when if you do need to use this. But it's intended for, there's a document with a virus, or something happened to the entire library and it got tanked. So
yeah, like if you were syncing a library and your machine got hit with malware and it encrypted everything.
Yeah,
I think they really did this for ransomware.
Yeah, exactly.
If you get a file, a file or two infected, and they're blocking you because of ransomware, you can dial the whole library back to before the ransomware was there. That was the big change here.
Yeah. So Mike Dixon is asking in the chat room when they implemented this. It's been years ago. It's been 3 or 4 years probably that this
probably
existed.
more than that.
Well, I knew it was available in OneDrive. I just didn't realize it was available in a library. That was the piece that I didn't make the connection. Like, because the OneDrive thing they announced, and I remember sitting in an MVP pre-day for Ignite way back when we used to go to Ignite. I know. But we were in Atlanta.
We haven't been to
I think.
Yeah, I mean it was in
It was a long time ago.
the 20 teens.
20 teens.
And it
Yes,
and
it
it was I think they announced it for document libraries first, and then it went to OneDrive, but I could be remembering it wrong.
To answer Mike's question, I don't know, Mike, that this is
it's a different team.
Lists.
It's a different
Yeah,
team.
it's a different
They don't
team.
do
It's
anything the
just
same
document
way.
libraries.
Yeah.
I love Dan's pro tip. It doesn't save you from a code delete non-recyclable option. Yes,
exactly.
Yes, this is why
Yeah.
you have to know what you're doing when you write code or PowerShell. Todd.
Francis,
right.
your question is valid if you got hit with ransomware like 2 years ago and you just realized it, you're going to be in bad shape.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily that it's 500 versions, it's more how much time has gone past.
Yep. All right. Now, some of the pitfalls of versioning, Mark, in Mark's slide earlier, he did mention storage consumption specifically to documents, but I do want to point out that when you enable documents, when you have versioning turned on with list items, if those list items have attachments, again, and you're using a tool or you're editing a list item multiple times, that instance of that attachment stays with each and every version, even if the actual attachment didn't change. So anyway, so we've got storage consumption. Obviously, each version is a document. There is a PowerShell command that you can run that will give you a list of the versions. I want to point out the workflows because this is actually where I came into this. I was doing a project to update workflows from on-prem, from 2010 workflows to Power Automate. And as I was doing the migration, one of the things, like, they had a recursive workflow that had put like 300 versions of this workflow, all with attachments. So just be mindful that especially if you're working with list items with attachments, that your workflows are doing the least amount of updating as possible. Also, security concerns, right? If you put something that shouldn't be in a document that has versioning turned on, and then you go and delete it and put it back, if someone is savvy enough to go in and get the previous versions, that sensitive information is still going to be there. Now, if you have the appropriate permissions, you can delete versions. However, if you're in an audit situation where that's not a possibility, then you might run into some issues. And lastly, same thing with the security concerns. If there are retention policies or labels, once those are in, those are in. If the retention policy says you can't delete it, you can't delete it. So you want to just make sure very, very closely that, before you're applying your retention policies and your labels, that you make sure that, everything is in a good spot and it's ready before you turn that stuff on.
Cool. All right. So we've sort of hit the history in less than 15 minutes, which is impressive. Considering who we have.
I wasn't there to talk about that first slide.
That's why I was like, how come we're so far? Oh.
Didn't we have 17 minutes on that first slide for Anderson?
We did. That's why. All right. So we're moving on now. Todd, talk to us about this new thing, configuring and managing this versioning thing you've got going.
Yeah, so this slide covers another thing that I think most of us learned in the research for this Ask Praxis, and this is where we can set these versioning settings. So Mark's slide had where we showed the library settings, and we'll get to that in a minute. But turns out there are a couple of other places where you can change these settings. Now, one thing the documentation says, and mostly seems to play out, it says that these settings are inherited. But I question their use of the word inherited. It feels more like a copy than an inheritance to me. So, and I'm used to like seeing permissions inherited in NT file shares and seeing permissions inherited in SharePoint. As I talk about how you change these things, you'll see why it feels more like a copy than an inheritance. The first place, the largest place where you can make these changes is from the organization level or the tenant level. So you go into SharePoint Admin Center, and on the left go under settings, and then there's a list of different kinds of settings you can get, and SharePoint version limits is one of those settings. And that lets you set the tenant or the organization default settings for sites and lists. And you don't have a lot that you can put in there. You can click automatic, which I'm going to cover here in a couple of slides, or you can select manual, and then by default it's like 500 versions. And I think, that interface is where Microsoft snuck in that 500 version default however many years ago when they put that in. They just set everybody's tenant at that, and everything rolled out from there. Now, I said earlier that I don't feel like these settings are inherited. If you go in and make a change there, if you change the manual from 500 versions to 100 versions, or if you change from manual to automatic or make any changes there, they are only applied to new sites. They are not applied to existing sites. So for the programmers in the audience, this feels like a copy by value as opposed to a copy by reference. So it just stamps out a template, and that's how it goes. So something to keep in mind after I talk about how the automatic versioning works. If you get all excited about that and run right over to Central Admin or SharePoint Admin Center and change that setting, know that you're still going to have some work to do on your existing assets.
I would like to pause and just reflect on the fact that Todd, the undeveloper, just made a comment about by reference variables. Okay, so we're all on the same page. Developer.
We can pull that out in editing with it.
Yeah.
It's just an important thing when you're using a language to know if a copy is by reference or copy.
Okay, keep trying.
Okay, so after you've got your organization set the way that you want, this was something that I didn't know existed, and this is the fact that you can set versioning settings at the site level. And as we were reading the different documentation and all that, it mentioned this out. I'm like, no way, like you can't do this. So of course I went right into a SharePoint site and went to all site settings and looked at all the settings, and there were no settings there for versioning. And so I felt kind of smug. I'm like, oh yeah, caught a bug in the documentation here. But then I was reading further, and you can set this with everybody's friend PowerShell. So the set SPO site commandlet that comes with the SharePoint management module has the set SPO site, and some of the parameters can deal with versioning. So this was something new. I had no idea that this was even possible. So you give it the site, and then you can set things, the title and all these other things. But you can set whether you use the automatic versioning, which they call enable auto expiration version trim. Because why would they call it the same thing that the interface calls it, or any of the documentation calls it? Why would you make any kind of consistency like that?
That's all over the place, though.
yeah, just beautiful in its complexity that there you have to translate all of it.
Anyone?
So in this example here, I've got that set to false, and I did that so that I could show some of the other things. So you can set the major version limit, the major version, or the major with minor version limit, expiration after days, all those kind of things. You can set that at the site level. Now you're probably asking yourself, when you change the organizational settings, you don't get your existing stuff changed. I assume then when you set the site level, you also don't get the existing stuff changed. Well, that is not correct. And we will cover that in another slide as well. The inconsistencies, they really roll on. So then the final play.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, I thought you wanted me to move on.
No. And then the final spot that we can make our changes is at the library level. And this is the place that we're all used to seeing them. It's been there since, SharePoint was in stone tablets. Go up to the settings, gear, settings, library settings, even more library settings, versioning settings. And that's the screen that we had at the beginning of the thing. Okay, so now we can go on. So what is this automatic version trimming that we've been talking about and foreshadowing and hinting? So it's a new thing that Microsoft released here, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. It's called intelligent versioning in some places. It's called automatic versioning in some places. It's called enable version trimming something your mama in PowerShell, but it's all the same thing. And this is the idea that not all versions are created equal, but not all versions are actually equal. The idea is that versions that are recent are more valuable than versions that are old. And we saw a couple of questions in the chat room. People are talking about shredded storage and things like that and said, why are we charged the entire value of a file size if we know in the background for Office documents, they're only changing the deltas? And so I put a comment in the chat room. They are stored by deltas. They are billed by full value, by full size. And so that's one of the ways we can get some of that storage back is by using something like this and not having to worry about, having 30 days. One of the things I wanted to mention about that manual thing is you can set manual versioning and it will manually age versions out once they're 30 days old or 60 days old or something like that. I think that is a horrible idea. I think that should have been under the There Be Monsters heading, because you can end up with a situation where you don't have any versions of a file. Now, it'll never delete the current version. You'll always have the current version, but I don't like how they implemented that. So what the automatic version does is it says, we're going to look at the age of a version and we're only going to collect or keep specific ones depending on how old each version is. So for the first 30 days, you can have up to 500 versions. Now, here's one place where the documentation wasn't consistent. On the page that explained the automatic, it said that you could have up to 500 versions for the first 30 days. But in the documentation for setting how many major versions you could have, it said that you could have up to 50,000 versions. It said between 100 and 50,000. So I don't know if you set it to something, if you set it to 600, if it lets you keep all 600, or if it prunes it to 500 once you turn automatic on. I'm not sure. But for
Tara has a question about the deleting of versions. It's not deleting the audit logs. He's saying if it's deleting the versions, it's not deleting the audit log entries for the versions that it deleted. I would say yes.
Yeah, that would be correct, because that's the audit log stores actions.
Yeah.
And so it would also record that it's deleting versions, but that doesn't mean that the version never existed.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah. And those audit logs, they roll over after 90 days now, I think is the default. So you want to make sure. Mark said in the chat room that he believes that they stopped doing shredded storage. That's a good question. I wonder how we would ever.
That's just my belief. No one's been able to prove to me that it's still happening. Given that a file that's 100 gigabytes is 100 gigabytes every copy.
Yeah. Good question. So back to the automatic versioning, and any version that is less than 30 days old, you get to keep. So those are the ones, yesterday afternoon at 2:07, yesterday afternoon at 2:24, they're all showing up there. Once a version gets to be 30 days old, then Microsoft starts to automatically trim the versions. And at 30 days, but less than 60 days, you get one version per hour. So it says it keeps the version at the top of the hour. I'm assuming it actually just keeps the first version that it encounters per hour. But if you have multiple versions per hour, it trims all but one. So it gives you that space back. At 60 days, it gets rid of all of the versions except for the first version of each day. So you have daily versions. And then at 180 days or 6 months, then you get weekly versions. So you get the first version that showed up during the week. I think the week starts on Sunday.
That's more generous than I expected it to be.
Yeah, and I was kind of surprised that they gave us the secret sauce, because all over it just tells us, the algorithm, but yet in one of the documents I actually found what the algorithm was. So yeah, I thought that was a pretty reasonable thing, and I think it would really help a lot of places out if this was turned on. I'm a little scared of the idea of versions getting deleted automatically, like that makes me a little tweaky, but honestly, as I look at this, I can't find any problems with it. All right, I think that's it for this.
All righty. So what happens when we turn it on?
Yeah, so if you turn it on at the organization level, new sites and new libraries inside of new sites get it, but existing ones do not. So this is the thing where you'll have to turn it on at the organization level and then decide how far and wide you want to turn it on. I read something somewhere, and I can't find it now because I had about 47 tabs open in my browser, that said that when you turn automatic version on at the library level, that existing versions are not trimmed regardless of their age, but only new versions are. And so I'm not sure about that, and I didn't set up a test environment to test that. So I should have put that on the slide. But existing ones stay exactly the same. When you turn this on at the site level, so this would be existing sites that existed before you turn it on at the organization level, or if you don't feel comfortable at the organization level doing it and you want to try it on a couple of sites first, by default, so remember this is PowerShell, so everybody gets to run new SPO site, or a set SPO site. All libraries get it by default. So this is different than at the organization level where only new objects get it. By this one, all objects get it. And again, this is another place where I feel like it's a copy, not an inheritance. New ones will get it immediately. So if you run set SPO site and then click like a bunny and run over and create a new site, it's going to have those new settings by default, but existing ones won't. There's a timer job that runs in the background that changes all the site settings, or all the list settings to the new settings. So again, it feels like that's kind of a copy. And then you have options where you can say, change the settings, but only for new document libraries, or you can change it that says only for existing ones. I don't know why you've got that level of granularity, but just make sure that when you run that, you understand what you want to do and then what the command is going to want to do. And then again, at the site level, you can just change it to automatic if you want. And I'm not sure if existing versions get pruned or not. There is some PowerShell out there that will prune those for you. Another thing that I wanted to mention is on Derek's slide, he had that command that said, create some kind of report. I forget what the name of that command was. There is another Exchange or Excel file you can download that will let you look at the different settings and see what would get pruned. And I thought that was kind of some cool stuff. So I think that's in the links in the, that's the one, the file version expiration report job. So I think all of the stuff that I talked about is in the resources file or on the resources slide.
Caleb asked, what is the impact of intelligent versioning on co-editing, if any?
So I believe that if you turn on the automatic or the intelligent versioning, everything works fine. You do bring up an interesting point, though. Nowhere in the interface can you shut off versioning or set the versions to 0. But I did find a note somewhere that said with PowerShell, either with set SPO tenant or set SPO site, you can remove versioning that way. But if you do, it breaks co-authoring. So somehow co-authoring and versioning are intertwined somehow. I'm not entirely sure how, but you're fine. You're fine using intelligent co-authoring or intelligent versioning with co-authoring.
Cool. All right. Well, that sums up all of the versioning talk that we wanted to have today. So here's a whole bunch of resources. Obviously, they're clickable because I'm sharing or presenting to Teams, excuse me. So you can click on any one of those. There's some resources to help you out. Excuse me. And then we have next time. So February 5th is our next Ask and Praxis, and we are going to delve into the misty world.
Del's been retired.
Oh, right. Okay, we're going to dive. We'll dive into the misty world of effective document management strategies for Microsoft 365. This is a title we worked on for quite a while. The idea is to sort of talk through documents in folders, documents in libraries, documents in sites, documents in other sites. Where do you put them? Why is management in one versus the other better or not as good, or depends on what you need to do, etc. That's what that episode is going to be all about. So definitely join us for that one on February 5th. In the meantime, Mark and I will be in Miami in a few weeks for my Community Days Miami. Really looking forward to that. Derek, myself, and Mark will all be at the Microsoft 365 Community Conference in Vegas. That's at the beginning of May. And then at ECS, which we were talking about before this whole episode started. And how do we get there? Going to Dusseldorf, Germany for European Collaboration Summit. That's Mark, myself, and Derek. And we look forward to seeing you next time, February 5th. So join us then. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Julie, discount code.
Oh, we don't have any. They're not on here. We'll get them.
Somebody stole our discount codes.
If you need them, ping us. We got stuff. We have codes.
Oh, do we have some? Oh, okay.
Or watch,
Well, they'll be
or
on the
better,
next slide, but if you need
watch
some.
last week's Ask Simpraxis, because I think they were on that slide, maybe.
Were they in a previous version of a document?
Yes.
They might have been.
Yes.
That's what it is.
We've reduced that metadata from our information architecture.
All right. Well, we'll paste them in the chat then so that everybody can have them. All right. We'll chat with you all later. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on Ask Simpraxis. We love getting your questions or session ideas. You can submit by using the link in About. If you find this helpful, hit that like or subscribe button and share this content with your colleagues.